For 30 years, gamers have been arguing about one thing: which Aladdin game is best, Super NES or the Genesis? It's a debate that's been raging ever since the two games launched in the very same month, and every time you think there's a definitive winner, the two sides seem to find a new thing to fight about. But what did the critics say in the 1990s? Was it this back and forth, or was there a clear winner in this 16-bit showdown? To answer those questions, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Die Hard Game Fan, Computer and Video Games, Hyper, Game Players, and more classic magazines that reviewed both versions of Aladdin when they first came out. Today we're going to see where the critics landed in this 30-year-old battle, and maybe even settle this debate once and for all. This is Magazine Matchup.
Get this! At school I found this magic lamp, and I wished for Disney's Aladdin for my Sega Genesis. It's like the movie! I got to battle sword-flashing thieves, and nasty palace guards, and ride a flying carpet. And I still have 2 more wishes. Prove it!
Sega Genesis and Disney's Aladdin game cartridge, each sold separately.
We're going to kick things off with the most competitive matchup of the day, and it comes from none other than Electronic Gaming Monthly. Here we see a quarter of a point separate the two games, with the Genesis version earning an 8.5 out of 10, while the Super NES game is slightly behind with an 8.25. That's pretty close, but you wouldn't know it based on the year-end Game Award segment that was featured in the 1994 Video Game Buyer's Guide. The Genesis game mopped up the competition, taking the Best Movie Game and Best Animated category, as well as earning the spot as the Genesis Game of the Year. The Genesis takes it when it comes to Electronic Gaming Monthly. Don't worry, not all of the matchups are going to be as close as EGM. Take Edge, for example, where the Genesis version won in what is clearly a decisive victory. They called the Genesis version brilliantly playable and noted that everything in it is just about perfect. The only quibble? The sound could have been better. 8 out of 10. The Super NES didn't fare as well, scoring a 6 out of 10. They complained that it was lacking so much, and what it lacks is so fundamental that you wonder what Capcom are playing at. It's hard to believe that they can mess up Aladdin when they've had so long to work on it. And with that, that's another vote for the Genesis. Now, one thing you'll find when reading the classic reviews is that most magazines liked both games, but had a real strong preference for one or the other. Let's go ahead and look at Die Hard Game Fan, who genuinely liked the Super NES game. I mean, they gave it an 89% and raved that the gameplay is perfect and everything else from the graphics to the music is absolutely top-notch. Aladdin on the Super NES is indeed good. The only problem is that Die Hard Game Fan felt that the Genesis version was great, and it wasn't even close. Giving the Sega published game an average score of 97%, this was the best reviewed game of the year. The development team at Virgin does in 3 months what most companies couldn't achieve in a year. Aladdin is, without a doubt, the most visually impressive cartridge-based game that I've ever seen. Now, that's another point for the Genesis. Even though the scoring system is a little different, GamePro echoed most of what Die Hard Game Fan was saying. With its great handling and catchy tunes, they felt that the Super NES version was a good game that won't disappoint, giving it a 4.5 out of 5. That's a strong score that would normally come out on top in most matchups, but not when the Genesis game score is a perfect 5 out of 5. Once again, length, graphics, and overall depth make this Genesis version a superior game. Point Genesis. One thing that really struck me while reading these classic reviews is how much the critics gushed over the Genesis game. Game Players, for example, called it one of the best action games ever, while praising the graphics and animations, tons of humor, and of course, great action. They described the Super NES version as the one without Digicel animation. Now, it is worth noting that they mentioned that the Super NES final boss is actually better than the Genesis version, but because it's too short and easy, it only scores an 85%. down from the 90% they gave the Sega version. Oh, that's a routing, because once again, that's a point for the Genesis. Now, before you accuse these critics of having an American bias, let me bat away any of those conspiracy theories. If we were to take the insanely long plane ride to Australia, you'd see that Hyper also preferred the Genesis version of Aladdin. Giving it a 90%, they asked, why can't all games look this good and play this well? 2 issues later, they gave the Super NES version a 90%, concluding that it might not look quite as good as the Mega Drive version, but it certainly plays as well. Once again, the magazine liked both, but preferred Sega's offering. Point for the Genesis, or I guess it would be the Mega Drive. Hey, remember when I said that the critics loved Sega's Aladdin and then said that it was one of the best action games ever made? Well, Computer and Video Games disagreed, giving it a surprisingly low score of 80%. Amanda argued that the Genesis version is perhaps suitable only for young children. When it came to CVG's Super NES review, Denise concluded that it's harder than the Genesis version and is the strongest movie tie-in for a long time. Wait a second, hang on. Didn't every other critic mention something about the Super NES version being too easy? Either way, Computer and Video Games gave the Super NES version of Aladdin an 82%, which means that they are now the first magazine to side with Capcom's version. The Super NES finally gets a point! With a score of 6-1, these are the 7 English language magazines that I could find that reviewed both versions of Aladdin. If you're thinking that maybe other foreign publications were kinder to the Super NES, I can tell you right now that they weren't. What, you don't believe me? Alright, let's do this. German magazine Power Play liked both games, but ultimately sided with the Genesis version, giving it an 88%. 8 points higher than the 80% they gave the Super NES version. Playtime liked the Genesis version even more, going as high as a 92%. Once again, that's 8 points higher than the Super NES game, which they gave an 84%. Still not convinced? That's fine, because here's the generically titled Video Games magazine, which bucked the 8-point spread. Based on the score, they absolutely loved the Genesis game, giving it a 94%, making it one of their highest scoring games of the year. The Super NES version, well, it was the middle of the pack with an 82%. And then there's ASM, which is the only magazine that I could find that gave both games the same score, a 92%. That makes it a draw, which feels like the perfect place to end this matchup. With a score of 10-2, it's not even close. The Genesis game is the clear winner. Of course, that doesn't mean that they were right, and you could even argue that time has given us greater clarity of each game. But back in the 1990s, it was Sega's Aladdin all the way. Oh, that was surprisingly easy. With that done, I wonder what the next debate we can solve with the magazine matchup.
Capcom.
Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we have a ton of shows looking at classic games and reviews and even old school journalism. Now, here's the question I have for you. What is the better Aladdin game? Is it the Super Nintendo one or the Genesis version? You've seen what the critics have to say, now I want to hear from you. Do you agree with what you've seen here, or are you a Super NES diehard? Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, next week we're going to announce our first big series of 2024. It's going to involve giving out real physical games. You can actually touch them. Intrigued? Tune in next week for more information. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,